The Vorthon had ruled the Orion Spur for 600 years, and in all that time, not a single conquered species had ever risen against them twice. They were tall creatures, standing nearly 3 meters high, with bodies covered in dark chitinous plates that clicked and scraped when they moved. Their eyes were black and empty, like deep wells that swallowed light and gave nothing back. They did not laugh. They did not sing. They did not create art or tell stories around fires at night. They had no word in their language for mercy, because the concept had never occurred to them. Their empire stretched across 400 star systems, and every single one had been taken by force. The Vorthon did not believe in diplomacy. They did not send ambassadors or trade delegations. They sent fleets, massive armadas of black dreadnoughts that blotted out the stars when they arrived in orbit above a new world. The message was always the same: kneel or be destroyed. Knelt. And then the real horror began. The Vorthon had learned long ago that brute force alone was not enough to hold an empire together. Soldiers could be stationed on every corner, and guards could watch every door, but eventually the numbers would turn against them. Eventually the conquered would realize they were many, and the Vorthon were few. So the Dominion had developed something far more effective than military occupation. They called them the unmakers. The unmakers were not soldiers. They were psychologists, scientists of the mind, experts in the architecture of fear. They would arrive on a newly conquered world within days of its surrender, and they would begin their work with cold and terrible patience. They studied each species the way a surgeon studies a body, looking for the weakest point, the place where a single precise cut would cause the entire structure to collapse. Every species had one. The Delvani were a people who stored their history and identity in great living trees that grew for thousands of years. The unmakers burned every single one of them, and within a generation, the Delvani could not remember who they had been before the Vorthon came. The Korath were a deeply social species who could not endure being alone for more than a few days without suffering severe psychological damage. The unmakers separated every Korath prisoner into individual cells and kept them there until their minds fractured like glass under pressure. The Haluni were a species that communicated through color, shifting the pigments in their skin to express emotion and meaning. The unmakers developed a chemical compound that locked their skin into a single dull gray, and an entire civilization went silent overnight. This was the way of the Vorthon Dominion. They did not simply conquer. They did not simply rule. They broke species at the deepest level of their being. And what remained afterward was not a people anymore. Workforce, obedient, hollow, and utterly without the will to resist. Zareth Kol had overseen 19 subjugations in his career. He was considered one of the finest high commanders in the Dominion, not because he was especially cruel, but because he was efficient. He understood the mathematics of terror better than most. He knew exactly how much force to apply and exactly where to apply it. He had never failed. He had never even come close to failing. When the long-range sensor arrays detected a new spacefaring species on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, Zareth Kol reviewed the preliminary data with the same calm detachment he brought to every new conquest. The species called themselves humans. They had only been traveling between stars for about 200 years. They had established a handful of colony stations on the edges of their home system and a few beyond it. Their military technology was primitive by Vorthon standards. Qualified as weapons, ships with thin hulls and slow engines, no planetary shields worth mentioning. The tactical assessment was straightforward. This would be a simple operation. A standard subjugation fleet of 20 dreadnoughts would be more than sufficient. Zareth Kol assigned it a priority rating of low and scheduled the fleet departure for the following cycle. He did not bother to study the species in any detail beforehand. There was no need. They were all the same in the end. Every species that had ever looked up at a Vorthon dreadnought darkening their sky had reacted in the same way, with terror, with desperation, and finally with surrender. He had done this 19 times. He could do it in his sleep. The fleet launched from the Vorthon staging world of Keth Voris and entered faster-than-light transit toward the human colonies. It was a journey of several days, and during that time the crew went about their duties with the mechanical precision that characterized everything the Vorthon did. There was no excitement, no anticipation, no pre-battle tension. They were not going to war. They were going to work. In the fleet's command center, Zareth Kal reviewed the profiles of the species that already served the Dominion. He did this sometimes before a new subjugation, not for strategic purposes, but because it pleased him to see the evidence of his empire's dominance. Dozens of species, all catalogued, all classified, all broken. Each one listed with its psychological vulnerability and the method used to exploit it. Each one marked with the same status designation, compliant. He scrolled through the list slowly. The Delvani, compliant. The Korath, compliant. The Heluni, compliant. The Yussar, the Brenthic, the Olamari, all compliant. Soon there would be a new entry. Humans. He already had a team of unmakers aboard the fleet, ready to begin their assessment as soon as the colonies were secured. They would find the weakness. Always did. As the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the first human colony station appeared on the view screen, a small, bright structure called Meridian, spinning slowly against the black. Zareth Kal felt nothing. No thrill, no hesitation, just the quiet satisfaction of a predator approaching prey that did not yet know it was being hunted. He opened a channel to the fleet. "Begin standard subjugation protocol," he said. 20 dreadnoughts moved forward, and the darkness between the stars grew a little darker. On Meridian Station, a woman named Alara Voss looked up from her work as the alarms began to sound. She did not know yet what was coming. None of them did. But she felt something shift in the air. A tension, a weight, like the moment before a storm breaks. She set down her tools and walked toward the observation deck. And far away, in the halls of the Vorthon Dominion, the unmakers sharpened their instruments and prepared to do what they had always done. They had no idea that this time would be different. They had no idea that they had just made the worst mistake in the history of their empire. It took the Vorthon 4 hours to seize all 3 stations. Meridian fell first because it was closest. The dreadnoughts surrounded it like wolves circling a campfire, and before anyone aboard could send a distress signal, the Vorthon had jammed every communication frequency within 10 million kilometers. The station's small security force, 32 men and women, armed with sidearms and good intentions, tried to mount a defense at the main docking ports. They held for 11 minutes. Halcyon Station fell next. It was a research outpost, home to scientists and engineers and their families. There were children on Halcyon, over 200 of them. The station commander surrendered without firing a single shot, because there was a Vorthon dreadnought aimed directly at the residential quarter, and the message was very clear. Port Solace was the last to fall, and the only one that put up a real fight. Commander Alara Voss had been stationed there as a military attaché. She had exactly enough warning to organize a defense that was brave and desperate and ultimately hopeless. Her people fought with everything they had. Security teams in the corridors, engineers venting atmosphere into sections where the Vorthon boarding parties advanced, maintenance workers wielding cutting torches and heavy wrenches against enemies in armored exoskeletons. It lasted 2 hours. In the end, Voss ordered the surrender herself because her people were dying, and she would not spend their lives for nothing. The Vorthon herded the populations of all 3 stations into containment zones, large open areas that had once been cargo bays and recreation halls. They stripped the humans of their tools, their communication devices, their personal belongings. They separated families when it suited them, and left them together when separation would have been a mercy. Then the unmakers went to work. The chief unmaker assigned to this subjugation was called Sithrak, was old by Vorthon standards, and he had broken 11 species in his career. He approached the human question with the same cold methodology he brought to every assignment. First, observe, then classify, then destroy. He spent the first 3 days simply watching the humans through surveillance feeds. He watched them huddle together in the containment zones. He watched them weep and hold each other. He watched parents try to comfort children who did not understand what was happening. He watched young men and women pace the walls like caged animals, their hands clenching and unclenching, their eyes burning with something the translation software identified as anger. He noted all of this with professional interest. Emotional bonding, strong. Social structure, complex. Attachment to offspring, extreme. Capacity for aggression, notable but poorly directed. On the 4th day, he began the interviews. He spoke to dozens of humans over the following week, always through a translation device, always in the same bare metal room with a single light overhead. He asked them about their fears, their loves, their histories. He asked them what they could not bear to lose. He asked them what made them cry and what made them scream. The answers were fascinating and contradictory. One woman said she feared loneliness above all else. A man in the next interview said he feared crowds. A teenager said he was afraid of the dark. An old woman said she was afraid of forgetting. Sithrak compiled the data and looked for the pattern. There was always a pattern. Every species had a single core vulnerability, one thread that when pulled would unravel the whole tapestry. But with humans, the threads went in every direction. Some feared death, some feared pain, some feared failure or shame, or the loss of people they loved. Some feared things that had not happened yet, and might never happen. They feared in ways that were wildly individual, stubbornly unique, and maddeningly inconsistent. Still, Sithrak was patient. He had done this before. He analyzed the data again and again, and eventually he found what he believed was the common thread beneath all the surface variation. Helplessness. Humans, he concluded, could endure almost anything as long as they believed they had some measure of control over their situation. Take that away, strip them of choice, of agency, of the ability to act, and they would collapse. It was not pain that broke them, or fear, or grief. It was the feeling that nothing they did mattered. He presented his findings to Zareth Kol with quiet confidence. The species is emotionally complex, but structurally fragile, he reported. If we remove their capacity for self-determination, if we make them understand that their actions have no consequences and their resistance has no effect, they will submit within 1 generation. Zareth Kol nodded. He had heard similar reports 19 times before. A public demonstration, he ordered. Show them what they are. The demonstration was held in the main cargo bay of Meridian Station. The entire population was forced to attend, over 3,000 humans packed into a space meant for shipping containers. Vorthon soldiers lined the walls, weapons drawn, black eyes watching. A group of human leaders was dragged to the center of the bay and forced to their knees. Colony administrators, station chiefs, senior officers, anyone who might serve as a symbol of resistance. They were stripped of rank insignia and made to kneel in a row on the cold metal floor while Zareth Kol addressed the crowd through speakers that made his alien voice echo off every wall. He told them what they already knew, that they belonged to the Vorthon Dominion now, that resistance was meaningless, that their old lives were over. He told them what they did not yet know, that their home system had been identified and that Earth itself would be visited in time. He told them that every species the Vorthon had ever conquered had learned to accept its place, and that humans would be no different. Then he walked along the line of kneeling leaders, and he looked down at each one in turn. Some were crying, some were staring at the floor with empty eyes. One man was shaking so badly his teeth were chattering. These were the reactions Zareth Cole expected. These were the reactions he had seen 19 times before. Then he reached Alara Voss. She was kneeling like the others. Her left shoulder was dislocated and hanging at a bad angle. There was dried blood on her face from a cut above her eye. Her uniform was torn and dirty. She was smaller than most of the Vorthon guards by more than a meter, and she looked fragile and broken and utterly defeated, except for her face. Alara Voss was smiling. It was not a grimace or a twitch of pain. It was not the vacant expression of someone whose mind had already shattered. A real smile, warm and knowing and deeply unmistakably amused, as if she had just heard a very good joke that no one else in the room had understood yet. Zareth Cole stopped. He stared down at her for a long moment, and for the first time in his career, he felt something he could not immediately identify. It was a cold sensation in his thorax, a tightness that had no tactical explanation. "Why are you smiling?" he asked. Voss looked up at him. Her eyes were bright and clear and not afraid. "Because you have no idea what you just did," she said. The crowd was silent. The Vorthon guards shifted their weight. The moments stretched like a wire pulled tight. Zareth Cole turned to Sithrak. "Take her," he said. "Find out what she knows." Sithrak took her, and what he found over the following weeks would keep him awake for the rest of his life. Because Alara Voss was not smiling because she was broken. She was smiling because she had already figured out how the Vorthon were going to lose. They kept Alara Voss in a cell that was 6 paces wide and 4 paces deep. The walls were smooth dark metal, with no seams and no markings. The light never changed, a flat white glow that came from everywhere and nowhere, designed to erase the difference between day and night, to make time feel like a river with no current. Sithrak visited her every day. He came with his instruments and his questions, and the vast accumulated knowledge of 11 shattered civilizations behind him. He had broken the proudest warriors of the Korath. He had silenced the most eloquent poets of the Heluni. He had taken species apart the way a child takes apart a clock, piece by piece, spring by spring, until there was nothing left but parts that no longer remembered how to work together. He sat across from Alara Voss in that featureless room, and he asked her questions. She answered some. She refused others. Sometimes she simply looked at him with that same quiet smile that had so disturbed Zareth Cole in the cargo bay, and Sithrak felt something he had never felt in the presence of a subject before. He felt like he was the one being studied. "Tell me about your fear response," he said on the 5th day. "Your species produces a chemical called cortisol under stress. It degrades cognitive function and physical performance over time. Prolonged exposure should render you compliant. Why has it not?" Voss leaned back against the wall of her cell. She had not been given medical treatment for her dislocated shoulder, and she held her left arm carefully against her body, but her voice was steady and almost conversational. "You are asking why stress does not break us," she said. "I am asking why you are not broken," Sithrak corrected. Voss considered this for a moment. "Do you know how human children are born?" she asked. Sithrak consulted his datapad. "Live birth. Gestational period of approximately 9 months. The offspring is born in an extremely underdeveloped state. Unable to walk, unable to feed itself, unable to survive without constant care. It is one of the most helpless newborn states of any species in our records." "That is correct," Voss said. "We come into the world completely powerless. We cannot lift our own heads. We cannot see clearly. We cannot do anything at all except scream and hope that someone answers. And that is how every single human being begins, utterly dependent, utterly vulnerable, utterly at the mercy of a universe that did not ask if we were ready." She paused, and let that sit in the air between them. And then we grow. We learn to lift our heads, and then to crawl, and then to walk, and then to run. And every single step of that journey is a fight against helplessness. Every human who has ever lived has already fought the battle you are trying to win, Sithrak. We fought it before we could speak. We fought it before we could think. We fought it in our cribs, and on our kitchen floors, and in schoolyards, and in hospitals, and in every dark night, when the world felt too big and too cold and too indifferent to care whether we survived. Sithrak's stylus had stopped moving. You are saying your species is adapted to helplessness? I am saying we are built from it, Voss said, and now the smile was back. Not mocking, not defiant, but something deeper, something that came from a place Sithrak had no instruments to measure. You looked at our psychology, and you saw that we fear losing control, and you thought that was a weakness. You were wrong. That fear is not our weakness. It is our engine. It is the thing that drives every single thing we have ever built, and every single thing we have ever become. She leaned forward, and even injured, even caged, even alone in a cell at the mercy of an empire that had never known defeat, her eyes burned with something that made the old unmaker want to look away. Your empire runs on terror, she said. Thing a species cannot endure, and you use it to crush them. You have done this to hundreds of civilizations, and it has worked every single time, because every species you have conquered had something they could not survive losing. The Delvani could not survive losing their memory. The Korath could not survive losing each other. The Haluni could not survive losing their voice. And so you took those things, and those species broke, and you moved on to the next. And humans are different, Sithrak said. Humans are different, Voss confirmed, because we have already lost everything. At one time or another, in one way or another, we have already experienced every kind of suffering you could possibly inflict on us. We have starved, we have been enslaved, we have watched our children die in our arms, we have been alone in the dark, with no hope and no help, and no reason to believe tomorrow would be any better than today. Her voice did not waver, her smile did not falter. We survived all of it. Not because we are strong, not because we are brave, because we are stubborn. Because somewhere deep in the wiring of every human brain, there is a voice that says, not yet and not today, and you will have to do better than that. You cannot use despair against us, Sithrak. We live in despair. We have always lived in despair. We build our homes in it. We raise our children in it. We fall in love in the middle of it, and we make music about it, and we laugh. We laugh, Sithrak, even when nothing is funny, even when everything hurts, even when we have every reason in the world to lie down and stop trying. She sat back. That is what you cannot break. That is what none of your instruments can measure. That is the thing I was smiling about in the cargo bay. You looked at us and saw a fragile species. You have no idea what you locked yourself in a room with. Sithrak sat very still for a long time. His datapad was dark. His instruments were silent. To the High Commander, he said finally. You should, Voss said. And while you are doing that, you should know something else. What? Right now, while you have been sitting here trying to figure out how to break us, the people in those containment zones have been talking to each other. They have been telling jokes and sharing stories and learning each other's names. They have been watching your guards and memorizing your patrol patterns and figuring out which doors are weakest and which systems are most vulnerable. They have been doing this not because anyone ordered them to, but because it is what humans do when you put them in a cage. We do not sit and wait to be saved. We start planning. Sithrak looked at her and saw that she was telling the truth, not because his instruments told him so, but because he could see it in her face, the way a person can see a storm building on the horizon, something vast and inevitable, and beyond anyone's power to stop, and left the cell without another word. His report to Zareth Kol was 3 words longer than any report he had ever filed. It included a phrase that no unmaker had ever used in the 600-year history of the Vorthon Dominion. The phrase was, "Standard methods insufficient." Zareth Kal read the report and dismissed it. Sithrak was old, he told himself. The old unmaker was losing his edge. There was no species that could not be broken. It was simply a matter of finding the right pressure point. He ordered Sithrak to continue the interrogation, and doubled the guard rotations in the containment zones. He did not increase surveillance on the communication systems, because the humans were not using any communication systems. The Vorthon had confiscated every device, every screen, every piece of technology that could transmit a signal. What they had not confiscated, because it had never occurred to them that it could be a weapon, was the human voice. The containment zones. Someone was humming. It was a simple melody. Nothing complicated. Nothing that would draw attention. Just a tune, passed from one throat to another, drifting through the crowded spaces like smoke. The Vorthon guards heard it and logged it as background noise. They did not know that the melody had a name. They did not know that the rhythm carried information, tapped on walls, beaten on floors, woven into the pattern of a song that 3,000 humans were learning by heart. They did not know that it was a countdown. And on the observation deck of Meridian Station, behind a locked door and a Vorthon security seal, a maintenance worker named Tomas Reyes finished rewiring a communications relay using parts he had hidden inside his shoes. He tested the connection, received a signal from Halcyon and another from Port Solace, and smiled the same smile Elara Voss had smiled, the same smile that Zareth Kal should have learned to. Fear. It began with a joke. Tomas Reyes was standing in the food distribution line on Meridian Station, surrounded by 300 tired and frightened humans, and watched by a dozen Vorthon guards whose black eyes swept the crowd like searchlights. He was exhausted. He had not slept in 2 days because he had spent both nights crawling through maintenance shafts, splicing wires, and building a communication network out of spare parts and stubbornness. But when he reached the front of the line, and a Vorthon guard shoved a nutrition pack into his hands, with the kind of careless contempt that comes from believing another creature is beneath your notice, Tomas looked up at the guard and said in a loud, clear voice, "You know what the difference is between Vorthon cooking and a recycling unit?" The guard stared down at him with no comprehension. "Nothing," Tomas said. "They both turn perfectly good material into garbage." The guard did not understand. Software flagged the statement as semantically inconsistent and categorized it as a minor cognitive malfunction. But the humans in the line understood. A woman behind Tomas snorted. A man 3 places back laughed out loud. A teenager near the wall covered her mouth with both hands and made a sound that was half giggle and half sob, because it had been weeks since anyone had laughed, and the sound of it was like water in a desert. The laughter spread. It moved through the line and out into the containment zone, and it did something that the Vorthon had never seen laughter do before. It changed the air in the room. Not the temperature, not the chemical composition, but something else, something that Sithrak's instruments could not detect, and Zareth Kal's tactical models could not account for. For 30 seconds, 300 humans remembered that they were not livestock. They were not a conquered species. They were people, ridiculous, stubborn, unbreakable people, could find something to laugh about even at the bottom of the worst situation they had ever been in. And that was the beginning. The signal went out that night. Tomas sent it through the patchwork network he had built. A single pulse, coded in a rhythm that every human on all 3 stations had learned through the melody that had been humming through the containment zones for days. The pulse meant one thing: tonight. At exactly the same moment, on all 3 stations, the lights went out. The Vorthon had backup power systems and emergency lighting that activated within seconds, but seconds were enough. On Meridian Station, a team of 11 humans, an electrician, 2 cooks, a teacher, a cargo handler, and 6 people who had never been in a fight in their lives, used those seconds of darkness to ambush a patrol of 4 Vorthon guards. They did not fight the way soldiers fight. They fought the way desperate people fight, with fury and terror and a complete unwillingness to stop. They used improvised weapons, metal bars pulled from bunk frames, chemical sprays made from cleaning supplies, a fire extinguisher swung with both hands by a woman who weighed 60 kilograms and hit like she weighed 600. 3 guards went down. The 4th fired his weapon and killed one of the humans before the cargo handler tackled him from behind and held him down, while the teacher, a quiet man named David Park, who had spent his career helping children learn to read, used a length of electrical cable to bind the guards' arms. They took the weapons, they took the armor, they moved on. On Halcyon Station, the uprising looked different because the population was different. Scientists and engineers did not charge guard posts. They did other things. They reprogrammed environmental controls to flood Vorthon-occupied sections with atmosphere that was breathable for humans but uncomfortable for Vorthon. They disabled artificial gravity in targeted sections, corridors, and watched as guards who had evolved on a high-gravity world floundered in zero-G, while humans who had grown up on space stations moved through weightlessness like fish through water. On Port Solace, where the fighting had been fiercest during the initial invasion, and where the population had the most military experience, the uprising was direct and brutal. Former security officers led teams through corridors they knew better than the Vorthon ever would, using maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts and access hatches that did not appear on any official schematic, because humans had built them as shortcuts and never bothered to file the paperwork. Within 2 hours, the humans had control of critical systems on all 3 stations. Not full control, the Vorthon still held the main docking bays and the armories and the command centers, but enough to matter. They had power, they had communications, they had air and water and doors they could lock. Alara Voss. The team that broke her out of isolation was led by a pediatrician named Amara Osei, who had never held a weapon before that night. She led 12 civilians through a section of Meridian Station that was supposed to be under heavy Vorthon guard, but was not, because 3 of the guards had been pulled to deal with a fire in Section 9, a fire that Tomas Reyes had started with a short circuit and a prayer. Amara's team reached the isolation block and cut through the door with a plasma torch stolen from the engineering bay. When the door fell open and Alara Voss stepped out into the corridor, blinking in the harsh light, Amara handed her a Vorthon sidearm and said, "We need you, Commander." Voss took the weapon and checked its charge with the ease of someone who understood violence the way a carpenter understands wood. Not because she loved it, but because she had studied it and knew its grain. "How many did we lose?" she asked. 14 so far, Amara said. "Maybe more on the other stations." Voss closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them, and the grief was still there, but it was packed tight and pushed down deep, where it could not interfere with what needed to be done. "Then we make it count," she said. She took command of the uprising, the way a conductor takes command of an orchestra, not by shouting orders, but by listening first, understanding what each section was doing, and then bringing them together into something greater than the sum of its parts. The Vorthon responded with force, because force was all they knew. Zareth Kol ordered his troops to retake the occupied sections by any means necessary. He authorized lethal response. He decompressed entire corridors to kill the humans hiding in them. He sent armored kill teams through the stations with orders to make examples of anyone they found. And the humans died. Many of them died. Some died fighting, and some died running, and some died simply because they were in the wrong place when a Vorthon soldier decided to make a point. But here was the thing that Zareth Kol could not understand, and that Sithrak had tried to warn him about. The dying did not stop them. When the Vorthon killed, the humans grieved. They wept for their dead, and they screamed, and they held each other in the dark, and they felt every loss like a wound that would never fully heal. And then they got up, and they kept fighting. Not because they were unfeeling, not because they did not value life. They fought harder because they did value life. Because every person the Vorthon killed had a name, and a face, and a story, and people who loved them, and the living owed it to the dead to make sure it meant something. The Vorthon had never encountered this before. Every other species they had subjugated responded to casualties by losing morale. Every other species pulled back when the cost became too high. Every other species eventually reached a point where the pain outweighed the principle and they broke. Humans did not reach that point. The pain and the principle were the same thing. Zareth Cole sat in his command center on the lead dreadnought, watching the tactical displays flicker and change as his forces lost ground on all three stations. And for the first time in his career, he felt the cold sensation in his thorax again, the same feeling he had experienced when Alara Voss smiled at him from her knees. He understood now what that feeling was. It was fear. He opened a secure channel to the Dominion High Command and transmitted a request for reinforcements. His message included a tactical assessment that used language no Vorthon commander had ever used before. The subjugated species is not responding to standard suppression protocols. They appear to grow more effective under duress. They learn and adapt at a rate that exceeds our tactical modeling. Degrade proportionally to casualties. It increases. I am requesting immediate reinforcement and recommend full reclassification of this species from standard threat to... He paused. His stylus hovered over the datapad. Then he wrote a word that the Vorthon Dominion had not used in 400 years. A word from the old wars, from the time before the Dominion had learned to break species instead of fighting them. The word was dangerous. He sent the message and waited for a response. He did not know that he would never receive one. The reinforcements never came. Not because the Dominion refused to send them, but because the Dominion did not know they were needed. The secure channel Zareth Cole had used to transmit his request had been intercepted, not by the humans on the stations, but by humans much farther away. Humans who had been listening since the moment the first colony went silent. The Solar Defense Coalition had been born in the 72 hours after Meridian, Halcyon, and Port Solace stopped transmitting. It was not a planned organization. It was not the product of years of military preparation or strategic foresight. It was what happened when every government and military force in human space looked at the same data and arrived at the same conclusion at the same time. Something had taken their people, and they were going to get them back. Admiral Chen Wei had been retired for 3 years when the call came. He was 61 years old, and he had bad knees and a heart condition. Spent the last year building a boat in his garage on Luna Colony, because he had decided he was done with war. He answered the call in 11 minutes. He was on a command deck in 4 hours. The fleet he assembled was not impressive by any conventional military standard. It was a collection of fast attack corvettes that had been designed for pirate interdiction, not fleet combat. Civilian cargo haulers that had been retrofitted with weapons bolted to their hulls by engineers who were making up the designs as they went along. Mining vessels with reinforced bows that could survive impacts no warship was meant to take. Survey ships whose sensor arrays had been repurposed for electronic warfare. And 3 Vorthon frigates. The frigates had been captured during the initial invasion. Small escort ships that the humans on Port Solace had seized during the first hours of the uprising, before the Vorthon locked everything down. A skeleton crew of engineers and military technicians had spent 6 days living inside those alien ships, sleeping in shifts, eating nothing but emergency rations, and reverse engineering control systems that had been designed for a species with 4 arms and a completely different nervous system. 6 days they learned to fly alien warships in 6 days. When the Dominion High Command eventually reviewed the records and learned this fact, it was added to the growing file on humanity with a note that read, "This should not have been possible." Admiral Chen Wei looked at his fleet, this ragged, improvised, utterly absurd collection of ships, crewed by soldiers and civilians and volunteers who had no business being in a battle, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Pride. Not the pride of a commander surveying a mighty force, not the pride of an empire flexing its power. It was the pride of a man who knew exactly how outmatched his people were, and who understood that they had come. Anyway, he addressed the fleet on an open channel. "You all know what we are flying into," he said. "You all know the numbers, 20 Vorthon dreadnoughts, against whatever we have managed to bolt together in the last week. I am not going to lie to you and tell you we have a good chance. I am not going to give you a speech about glory or sacrifice. You are here because someone you know or someone you love is on one of those stations, and you decided that was reason enough." He paused. "The Vorthon have ruled this part of the galaxy for 600 years. They have conquered every species they have ever met. They believe they are invincible, and they believe we are weak, and they believe this will end the same way it has always ended." His voice was quiet and even, and carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of the universe to know its cruelties, and had chosen to face them anyway. "Let us go teach them otherwise." The fleet jumped, too, faster than light. When they emerged on the other side, the Vorthon subjugation fleet was arranged in standard orbital formation around the 3 stations, a defensive pattern designed to project overwhelming force in all directions. It was a formation that had never been broken, because no species had ever attempted to break it. Chen Wei broke it in the first 8 minutes. He did not use Vorthon tactics or the tactics of any other species the Dominion had encountered. He used human tactics, a chaotic, layered, constantly shifting approach that drew from sources the Vorthon could not have predicted. The fast attack corvettes used hit-and-run patterns adapted from ancient cavalry warfare on the plains of Central Asia. The cargo haulers moved in formations borrowed from defensive strategies in a game called football. The mining vessels used a battering approach inspired by something a young lieutenant had seen in a competitive video game 3 years earlier. 3 captured Vorthon frigates flew straight into the heart of the enemy formation, broadcasting Vorthon identification codes, which caused 6 seconds of confusion among the dreadnought crews. 6 seconds, during which the frigates disabled the shields of 2 capital ships, and the corvettes poured fire into the gaps. It was not elegant. It was not beautiful. It was messy and desperate and chaotic, and it cost human lives. Many human lives, in ships that were never meant for this, doing things they were never designed to do. But it worked. The Vorthon fought back with everything they had, and everything they had was considerable. Their weapons were more powerful. Their ships were stronger. Their crews were better trained and better equipped, and they outnumbered the human fleet by a significant margin. None of it mattered, because the humans kept adapting. Every time the Vorthon settled on a counter-strategy, the humans changed their approach. Every time the Vorthon targeted a weakness, the humans found a way to turn it into a strength. A cargo hauler with a destroyed engine used its remaining momentum to ram a dreadnought's weapon array. A corvette with no weapons left used its communications array to blind an enemy's sensors. A mining vessel that was breaking apart held its position in a critical lane long enough for 3 other ships to get through. And its crew did not abandon their posts because the people on those stations were counting on them. On the bridge of the lead dreadnought, Zareth Kol watched his fleet die around him, and he understood at last what Sithrak had been trying to tell him, what Alara Voss had been trying to tell him, what every human on every station had been showing him since the moment he arrived. He had not conquered a weak species. He had attacked a species that was forged in struggle, tempered by suffering, and absolutely unwilling to accept defeat. not because they did not know what defeat felt like, but because they were absolutely unwilling to accept it. Because they knew it intimately, and had decided long ago that they would face it every single time, and get back up every single time, and keep going every single time, no matter what. He opened a communication channel to the human fleet, one final attempt. "Surrender," he said. "You cannot win. You are outgunned and outmatched. Surrender and I will spare your lives." The face that appeared on his view screen was Admiral Chen Wei. The old man was sitting in a command chair on a converted mining vessel, with sparks falling from a damaged ceiling behind him, and blood running from a cut on his forehead, and alarms sounding in the background. And he was smiling. That same smile. "You know," Chen Wei said calmly, "across our history, every tyrant who ever ruled our people eventually learned the same lesson. You can scare us, you can hurt us, you can even kill a lot of us, but you cannot make us stop getting back up." The channel closed. The battle was over. 14 of the 20 Vorthon dreadnoughts had been destroyed or disabled. The remaining 6 fled, and the humans let them go. They let them go. In the records of the Vorthon Dominion, there was no precedent for this. Every other species that had won a military victory pressed the advantage, conquered territory, took prisoners, seized resources. That was the way of things. The strong consumed the weak. The humans did none of this. Instead, Admiral Chen Wei sent a single message to the Dominion High Command on an open channel that every species in the Orion Spur could hear. "We are humanity. We do not kneel, and we do not rule. But if you come for us, or anyone under our protection again, we will remind you why you learned to be afraid of the dark." On Meridian Station, the containment zone doors opened for the last time. 3,000 humans walked out into the corridors of their station, and breathed air that tasted like freedom and smoke. The future. Alara Voss stood on the observation deck, and watched the wreckage of Vorthon dreadnoughts tumble slowly through the void, glowing like dying embers against the black. She was tired in a way that went deeper than her bones, deeper than her mind, all the way down to whatever part of a person holds the weight of everything they have been through, and everything they have survived. Tomas Reyes found her there. He was bleeding from a dozen small wounds, and his hands were shaking from exhaustion, and he had a bruise on his jaw that was going to be spectacular in a few hours. He stood beside her, and looked out at the stars, and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked, "Think they will be back?" Voss smiled. Not the smile of a soldier, or a commander, or a symbol of resistance, just the smile of a human being who had looked into the worst the universe had to offer, and found something inside herself that the universe could not take away. "I hope so," she said. And far away, in the halls of the Vorthon Dominion, the High Command gathered to discuss what had happened. They reviewed the battle data. They studied the tactical recordings. They read Sithrak's reports, and Zareth Call's desperate messages, and the transcript of Chen Wei's final transmission. And for the first time in 600 years, the masters of the Orion Spur looked at each other across their great dark council chamber, and felt something they had spent their entire civilization teaching others to feel: fear. The word human was entered into the Dominion Threat Registry at the highest classification ever assigned to any species. The file was accompanied by a single recommendation from Sithrak, the old unmaker, who had spent his life breaking civilizations and who had finally met one he could not break. His recommendation was one word: avoid. They did not avoid them. They came back once 9 months later with a fleet 3 times the size of the first. The battle lasted 45 minutes. After that, the Vorthon Dominion formally requested membership in the Terran Accord as a protected species. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all on Alara Voss, who smiled when she heard the news.